The professor was lecturing about why humans die when I drop my pen. He was somewhere in his 70s and spoke slowly enough that I could feel my attention drifting before he finished a sentence. I was twirling a rollerball pen out of boredom when it slipped from my fingers and rolled under the desk. I ducked down to grab it, and that was when I noticed something black wedged into a hidden groove beneath the desk. I scratched at it, and it came free with a small snap. Before I could examine it, the professor's voice cut across the room asking the student burrowing under his desk to answer the question. My dorm friends behind me were already snickering. I sat up with a hot face and managed to stammer out the answer based on what was printed in the textbook. The Hayflick limit. He let me sit down without further comment. While he turned back to the blackboard, I got my first proper look at the object I had pried loose. It was a USB drive, but a strange one. About 12 centimeters long, shaped like a carbon rod, pitch black with no brand, no markings, and no indication of storage capacity. The only thing identifying it as a USB drive at all was the port on one end. I slipped it into my pocket and decided I would look at it properly back in the dorm. The lecture went on. The professor explained that human cells could only replicate around 56 times before they stopped dividing, which capped the natural human lifespan at roughly 120 years. He went into telomere shortening with each division until they could no longer protect the gene structure, at which point the cell entered senescence. Then he moved on to something more interesting. He wrote the immortal Gila on the board and explained that the line came from a woman named Henrietta Lacks in 1951. Her cervical cancer cells doubled every 24 hours and never stopped dying. The retrovirus behind her cancer had flipped a lifespan switch in ordinary cells, and her line had since been used in cloning, in radiation research, and even in space experiments on cell growth in zero gravity. He said over 50 million tons of HeLa cells have been cultivated to date, and several students started clapping. He cut the applause off by pointing out that if a human played with that same switch in their own body, the cells would simply become tumors and kill them. Then he got to the part that actually quieted the room. In 2002, a professor at Cambridge had identified the genetic mechanism behind cell death and named it programmed cell death. The implication was that aging was not a natural process at all, but a kind of suicide instruction written into our genes. If that flaw could be corrected, immortality stopped being a metaphor. The professor told us that as biology students, we were the generation closest to immortality in human history. Then he dismissed the class to a long round of applause. I left with the black USB drive in my pocket. I skipped basketball after class and went back to the dorm alone. The professor's talk about immortality was still rattling around in my head, but not enough to keep me from wanting to look at the USB drive properly. I opened my textbook first and pretended to study. The phone kept lighting up with messages from the dorm group chat, and I made a point of ignoring it. After a few minutes of staring at notes without absorbing anything, I gave up and pulled the drive out of my pocket. I figured the previous owner was long gone. That classroom hosted 4 or 5 classes a day, and the groove I had pried the drive out of was hidden enough that I had only spotted it from the awkward angle of reaching for my pen. It could have been wedged there for years. I plugged it in. Nothing showed up in my computer. I plugged it in a second time with the same result, then rebooted into BIOS, reset to default settings, and tried again. This time the drive appeared, but the properties window listed its total storage as 0. I assumed it was corrupted. Out of habit, I double-clicked anyway, and the drive opened. Inside were 4 AVI files named Juan, Final Destination, One Missed Call, and Ring. The previous owner had apparently been a horror enthusiast. I had either watched these already or actively avoided them, so I selected all 4 and tried to delete them. Windows threw a program error. I tried again, switched to a file shredder, and nothing took. The files refused to leave. I hovered over Juan, thinking I might as well play one of them, and something in my chest tightened in a way that was hard to describe. It felt like being watched from a part of the room that the light did not reach. I moved the cursor away without clicking. To check whether the drive was working at all, I copied a Detective Pikachu file from my D drive over to it. The transfer finished in under 2 seconds. I opened that copy instead, and the movie played without issue. I had watched it before, but I kept the file because the Pikachu in it reminded me of my dog Jerry, who had died of old age the year before. I was a few minutes into the movie, drifting a little, when something moved at the edge of my vision. I turned and saw that a cap had appeared on the desk next to my laptop. I had no memory of it being there a moment earlier. The screen threw another program error in the same instant, and the video closed itself. The cap was familiar in a way I could not place until I picked it up. It was made of khaki canvas, hand-sized, and shaped like a duckbill cap that would fit something far smaller than a human head. The tag stitched inside said to return it to Harry Goodman at 1722 Green Street, Rhyme City. It was Pikachu's cap from the movie I had just been watching. I checked under the bed, the sheets, and inside the desk drawer in case one of my dorm mates was setting up a prank. The room was empty, and there was no way they could have known I would put on Detective Pikachu in the first place. My eyes went back to the USB drive. The shell that had been glossy black an hour earlier now looked dull, the way metal looks after it has been left out long enough to oxidize. I closed the error window and tried to play the movie again. Another program error. On a whim, I hit delete, and this time the file vanished without complaint. The horror movies still refused. The pattern seemed to be that only a movie that had been played and then errored out could be removed. I copied Detective Pikachu back in to test the theory. I played it, fast-forwarded to a scene with Pikachu, and concentrated on the idea of pulling him out of the screen. Within seconds, the movie shut itself off. The error window returned, and a second cap materialized on the desk. It was identical to the first, down to the handwriting on the tag. The drive was visibly worse for it. Whatever the extraction cost, it was costing the drive in physical condition. Both times I had been thinking about Pikachu specifically, and both times I had gotten a cap and nothing else. Either the drive could not produce living things, or it did not have enough energy to try. I got up and locked the dorm door before I let myself think any further. Then I pulled a blank notebook out of the drawer and started writing things down, partly to organize what I had, and partly to keep my hand from shaking. I wrote that the principle behind it was unknown. Under conjectures, I listed aliens, people from the future, and brain in a vat, and felt foolish enough to almost laugh while writing it. Under ability, I wrote that the drive seemed to extract an item from a video into reality, mediated by the thoughts of whoever was watching, and that it did not appear to work on living things. For rules, I noted that videos could be copied in freely but could not be deleted while intact, that a file only became deletable once an item had been extracted from it, and that I had not yet tested limits on the size, mass, or other physical properties of what could be pulled out. At the bottom, I added that the drive had aged visibly from new to worn over the course of 2 extractions, and that I did not yet know whether that was a matter of energy or something else entirely. I was scared to run too many more tests in case the drive's energy really was finite. Better to stake it on something worth having. I started with Avengers Endgame, on the theory that if I could pull an infinity gauntlet out of it, nothing else mattered. The transfer failed with a program error. I tried twice more, then switched to less fantastical films. Alita, Godzilla, and Terminator all copied into the drive without issue, while Ninja refused. The pattern was obvious. Movies grounded in something close to reality went in, and pure fantasy did not. To be thorough, I also tried an animated film, a comic, a still image, and a novel, none of which transferred. The drive only accepted live-action video built on a reality framework. I added that rule to the notebook and then sat with what I actually wanted out of this thing. Money was the easy answer. Treasure hunt movies were full of gems I could pull out and sell. Even setting aside the question of how to launder any of it, the professor's lecture that morning was still in my head, and money would not buy the one thing I actually wanted, which was time. I crossed it out. Power was next, meaning handing the drive over to the Federation and letting myself be promoted into the political machine for the contribution. That ended in a third world war in one direction, and in me quietly disappearing as an inconvenient witness in another. I crossed that out too. What I actually wanted was strength, and not just the physical kind. I meant capability in the abstract sense, covering technology beyond current science, abilities beyond ordinary limits, and a longer lifespan. The first instinct was to pull exoskeletons and mech suits out of sci-fi films, but anything that obvious would put Federation agents at my door inside a week. I needed something that improved me without being visible. I listed substances from films that fit the reality rule. Compound V from The Boys was out because it was addictive, unstable, and only worked on infants over a long course of injections. The augmentation drug from Push was out because it depended on genetic mutation, which had abysmal odds. The crystalline from Chronicle gave telekinesis, but it came with nosebleeds, escalating power that a human body was not built to contain, and a habit of amplifying its users' worst impulses. T-virus and G-virus were viruses, which the drive would not produce as a matter of rule. CPH4 from Lucy was the most tempting because the protagonist effectively became a god, but the price was a lifespan of days. Most users died on contact, and the entire premise rested on the discredited idea that humans only use 10% of their brains. There was a long list of Marvel substances that would have suited me perfectly, including the super soldier serum and the heart-shaped herb, but every one of them came from a film the drive would not accept. That left only one option on the page: NZT-48. NZT-48 came from a 2012 film called Limitless. It was a drug that unlocked the brain's potential, which did not mean the pseudoscientific 10% claim, but the idea that a brain already running at full capacity could still be made sharper. The pill gave the user perfect recall, exceptional pattern recognition, and the ability to integrate details most people would never consciously notice. Memory went from a disorganized warehouse to a sorted library where anything could be retrieved on demand. The side effects were severe. The film treated it as a metaphor for drug addiction, so quitting brought withdrawal, headaches, memory loss, and eventually brain death. I did not consider that a deal breaker. Every substance on my list had side effects, and as a biology major, I had a chance of synthesizing something to counteract them. I downloaded Limitless, copied it into the drive, and clicked play. I dragged the progress bar forward to the scene where the protagonist finds his brother-in-law's stash hidden in the oven, paused on the sealed bag, and reached toward the screen on instinct. The bag drifted forward. My hand passed through where the screen had been, and I closed my fingers on something solid. When my senses caught up, I was holding a palm-sized plastic bag of unmarked pills. The drive looked like trash by then. Whatever gloss had been left was gone, and the casing had the surface of something abandoned outside for decades. I quietly hoped it could be recharged, but I had nothing to base that hope on. I taped the drive to my arm with several layers of adhesive tape after spending too long deciding where else to put it. Then I ran the antivirus, wiped the system records, and shut the laptop down. I took the notebook and the 2 Pikachu caps into the toilet, burned them on the floor with a lighter, swept the ashes into the urinal, and flushed. With the pills hidden in my underwear, I left the dorm and walked to the campus animal laboratory center. As a biology student at Chengdu Jiaotong University, I knew enough about clinical trials to know I was not going to swallow an unidentified compound without testing it on something else first. A proper human trial was out of reach, but an animal one was not. I bought 8 Kunming mice, along with 2 M1 cages and the rest of the equipment. The dorm had too much foot traffic, and the campus labs were monitored, so I booked a standard room at a hotel near campus instead. I locked the door, numbered the mice 1 through 4 in each cage with a black marker, sterilized everything, and weighed out a single pill. I calculated a dose proportional to my own body weight, dissolved the pill, and diluted the solution. I fed the mice through a gavage needle. Mouse 1 in each cage received the body weight equivalent, while mice 2, 3, and 4 received double, triple, and quadruple that amount. I sealed what was left of the solution and watched the cages. By 6 in the evening, nothing had happened to any of the mice. If anything, the ones on higher doses looked a little livelier than the others. The drug at least did not appear to be acutely toxic. Chronic toxicity was the bigger question, and the only way to answer it was to wait. I gave myself 7 days. If the mice were still healthy at the end of it, I would take the pill myself. For the next week, I split my days between class and the hotel. 2 hours at lunch and 2 more from 6 to 8. I fed the mice, swapped the mattress, and watched for any sign that the dosing was catching up to them. None of them got sick. None of them fought. They ate their daily ration and got excited whenever I gave them a peanut or a walnut. The cost was killing me. The hotel ran over $1,000 a week against a monthly allowance of $1,500, and by the halfway point, I was already eating the cheapest canteen meals. After 7 days, I decided it was safe enough. I would have liked to run a withdrawal test as well, but I could not afford it, and I had already burned through a pill over the testing period. I gave the mice a final meal, prepared a tribromethanol solution, and dosed each of them deliberately high into the lower abdomen. They went under within 3 minutes and stopped breathing inside 10. Anesthesia overdose was the most humane method available, more so than dislocation, decapitation, or bleeding them out. I carried the bodies to an empty alley, doused them with a bottle of alcohol from a pharmacy, and lit them. 500 or 600 degrees of incineration would break the molecular bonds in the drug either way. After that, I did not go back to campus. I got lunch outside, took the subway to Chengdu People's Hospital, and walked into the emergency department. The mice surviving did not actually prove anything about humans. Chocolate was harmless to people and poison to rodents, and the reverse situation existed too. If the pill turned out to be toxic only to humans, I wanted to already be standing in a hospital when I found out. The subway televisions were running news on a loop, since reception underground was useless for anything else. One story caught my attention on the way over. A man on Renmin Road had taken 3 stab wounds intervening in a kidnapping before the police arrived. A pair of aunties nearby were on their way to Mass and complaining about how few young men like that were left these days. The hospital was busy enough that no one looked at me twice. I sat in a corner of the emergency waiting room, took out the pill I had prepared, and put it in my mouth. Then I closed my eyes. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then I noticed my hearing. A woman nearby was on the phone with her daughter, hoarse and trying not to cry, telling her that her father had collapsed. A stretcher was being forced through a clogged corridor, the nurses snapping at family members to step aside. A couple in front of me were whispering, the wife in tears, while their daughter kept asking what was happening to her father. Every conversation in the room was reaching me with the same clarity, distinct from each other. Each word and every emotion behind it landing in my head as if it had been spoken directly into my ear. It was less like overhearing and more like listening to a symphony. When I opened my eyes, the world looked different. The lamp overhead was flickering at a frequency I should not have been able to perceive. The disinfectant in the air arrived in distinct waves, and I could pick out every footstep and breathing pattern in the room at once. Nothing had changed about the world. The way I was taking it in had. My memory was doing the same thing. Anything I had ever seen or heard surfaced when I reached for it, and connections formed on their own. The first thing the drug made me remember was that Limitless had been adapted into a television series 3 years after the film. The film had ended with the protagonist claiming he had figured out how to neutralize the side effects without ever showing the solution, which was why the drive could not produce it. A series running across an entire season would have needed more story than a film, though, so the odds were good that the show had eventually revealed what the movie skipped. Both versions were blocked in mainland China for political reasons, but I found the show on a niche site without much trouble. I skipped to the finale. The solution was called an immunity shot. There was a temporary version that lasted a few weeks, and a permanent version that existed only once in the entire show, in the final episode. I had only known about the adaptation because I had glanced at a news item about it 4 years earlier, when I was 14, and forgotten it the same day. Within 3 minutes of taking NZT, that buried scrap had surfaced and given me a workable lead. It also meant I had picked wrong. The crystalline from Chronicle would have been the better choice. Researching the drive was going to take enormous amounts of money, and a clean superpower would have let me generate that money directly, while NZT only stimulated the brain. To turn that into income, I still had to accumulate the right knowledge first. The stock market was not a shortcut either, given that I had no capital and the Chinese market was openly manipulated. The pills themselves were finite. I had counted 500 in the bag, 12 hours each, which gave me 18 months at one a day before the supply ran out. If the drive died before I had solved the side effects, things were going to get interesting. There was no point regretting the choice. I stood up to leave. On my way out, I passed the little girl and her mother. My hearing picked something up through the emergency room door, so I stopped, told the girl her father would be out soon, and added that he was a hero. Her mother looked up at me, startled, and I left before she could put together a question. The door opened a moment later. A nurse came out asking for the family of Yang Yuexin and told them the operation was over and that the patient had stabilized. It was not prophecy. I had heard the conversation through the door. I had also seen the news story on the subway televisions on the way over, without paying any attention to it. And on my way out, I had registered that the little girl's eyebrows matched the eyebrows of the man who had been stabbed on Renmin Road. Renmin Road was close enough that any emergency call there would route to this hospital, and the age, the time, and the location lined up. Identifying the connection at all was the easy part. Pulling those specific pieces out of everything else rattling around in my head was the part the drug actually did. On the subway back, I kept writing in the notebook. Even with NZT running, I was not willing to make assumptions about the drive. It had already broken everything I knew about physics, and the plan was to test it as quickly as I could. I got back to the dorm around 3. Everyone was in Professor Deng's biochemistry class, which gave me the room for the next 2 hours. I locked the door, plugged the laptop in, and started downloading the final episode of the Limitless TV series. The drive itself was a concern. I had been checking it daily for the past week to see whether it would recover any of its original gloss, on the theory that the previous owner had left it charged and it might restore itself. It had not changed at all. Either the recovery period was measured in years, or the drive did not recharge in any way I could see. Once the episode finished, I copied it over and double-clicked. A program error window came up, and the file refused to play. NZT held me steady through the disappointment. One of the things I had not expected from the drug was the composure it gave me. For most people, calmness was an effort, and while I was on the pill, it was simply the default state of my mind. I tried creating a new folder on the drive instead, which worked without complaint and ruled out the hardware being broken. The problem was with the video itself. I started downloading the rest of the series and used the wait to test something else. I opened my college English textbook. a subject I had been treating as a lost cause since I had picked biology specifically to avoid English and math. The room went quiet around me. Old junior high lessons surfaced and slotted into the new material on their own, and gaps from years earlier resolved on the spot. When I came back to myself, I was on the last page of the book, and an hour had passed. I had absorbed an entire semester of English in a single sitting. It was the first time in my life that studying had felt like something I actually wanted to keep doing. The download finished while I was still processing that. I copied all 22 episodes into the drive, opened the finale, and this time it played without error. The hidden rule fell into place. The drive needed a complete story before it would instantiate anything from any part of it. A single episode out of a series was not enough, and I had no idea how many other conditions the drive was hiding. I skipped to the scene with the permanent immunity shot and paused on it. The screen took on the quality of clear water, and the shot drifted up and down inside it, as if it was already half real. I reached for it. The footage froze before my fingers closed. Something stung my fingertip the way a bug bite stings, and when I pulled my hand back, blood was running down it. A small piece of flesh was missing from the pad of my finger. A new window had appeared on the screen, and it was not a program error. The message read, "Insufficient energy." The error message was good news in a roundabout way. If the drive could tell me it was out of energy, the energy was a measurable thing, which meant it could probably be replenished. The only question was, what kind of energy to feed it? I looked at the IC card electricity meter embedded in the wall above the dorm door. It showed 52.65 kilowatt-hours of usable power left in the room. The dorms allowed high-wattage appliances up to a 10-amp ceiling, and with the laptop off, my appliances would be the only thing competing for power on the meter. I checked the specifications I needed. The USB port on the laptop topped out at 2.5 watts, which was too small to register on a meter that only displayed 2 decimal places. The power strip on the desk had a dedicated USB port rated at 5 volts and 4 amps, which gave a maximum draw of 20 watts. If the drive pulled anything close to that, it would show up. I plugged the drive into the strip, shut the computer down, set a 1-hour timer, and opened a copy of Modern Molecular Biology to fill the time. I finished the entire book inside the hour and was not satisfied. The text was too general for what NZT was making me hungry for. I would need a real library. When the timer went off, the meter had dropped from 52.65 to 52.63. The drive had drawn exactly 20 watts over the hour, which confirmed it could be charged on ordinary household current. The discovery was almost as significant as instantiating NZT-48 in the first place. I pocketed the drive just as I heard footsteps in the corridor. Lebo kicked the door open and yelled at me for missing the biochemistry class. I told him I had cleared the absence with the counselor and that I would prefer not to be seen walking with him in public because he was the kind of person someone might decide to hit on sight. He asked about dinner. I told him I had no money and walked out. The exchange had gone too easily. The version of me from a week earlier had been quiet and uncertain in a way that I no longer recognized in myself. NZT had turned the dial up on confidence and composure, and the shift was large enough that anyone who actually knew me was going to notice. The simplest solution was to spend less time around them. I bought 4 steamed buns at the canteen for 2 yuan, ate 2, and saved the other 2 for later. Then I walked to the library, working through the next steps in my head. Getting full value out of the drive meant supplying it with real power, not whatever trickle-a-dorm USB port could deliver. I had no idea how much energy it actually held, but the number was almost certainly larger than I could pull through a residential outlet without someone noticing. That meant money. Enough money to lease industrial space or build a private power source somewhere no one was watching the line draw. The only tool I had for making that kind of money was NZT, and NZT only paid out after I had poured the right knowledge into it first. The library was full when I got there. I found a spot in the foreign language reading room and pulled a copy of Modern University-level English off the shelf. I had always treated English as a tax that compulsory schooling demanded of me, and as I sat down with the book, I finally understood why the older generation had insisted on it. North America was the effective core of the Federation in economics and in technology, and almost every paper worth reading was written in English. Translations leaked meaning, and the meaning that leaked tended to be the part that actually mattered. If I was going to do real research, English was not optional. The reading room administrator woke me up after 5 hours. The library was closing. Books had stacked up around me at some point, including Cambridge IELTS, Official Guide to Blue Delta, and several others, and I shelved them on my way out. It was early December and already dark out. The orange streetlights picked out the path through the trees. I had not eaten or had anything to drink in about 6 hours, and yet I was not hungry, not tired, and not noticeably less alert than I had been on waking that morning. NZT was apparently running my body off something that was not food. I made a note to dose between 10 in the morning and noon, so the 12-hour active window matched my waking hours. The film had mentioned that dissolving the drug in glucose and injecting it intravenously stretched the effective time to 13 hours, but I was not bringing needles into this. The supplies were too visible. The marks on my arm were too easy to misread, and one bad guess from anyone close to me would eventually surface both the drug and the drive. When I got back to the dorm, I walked into a wave of alcohol. Joe G was rolling around howling on Wang Wei's bed, drunk and freshly dumped from a relationship that had apparently ended before it had properly started. Wang Wei told me to take the bottom bunk and watch Ju Ji overnight, and I told him I would consider the night a win if Ju Ji did not throw up on anything. I remembered I had not finished my buns and ate them, which prompted Wang Wei to call me cheap. I explained that I had 200 yuan left until the end of the month. Joe Ji heard chewing, asked what I was eating, and I told him cephalosporins and offered him one. He stopped crying long enough to consider it. The night degraded from there. Someone downstairs started yelling at Wang Wei for shaking the bed frame. Li Bo yelled back, and eventually everyone wore themselves out and went to bed. I could not sleep. NZT had a 12-hour runtime, and I had taken the pill at 2 in the afternoon, so it was going to be active in my system until 2 in the morning, regardless of what my body felt like doing. I got up quietly and logged into Jaccount on the laptop. I had originally been thinking about reverse engineering NZT to produce a real-world antidote. With 7 hours of biology reading and a clearer head, I could see how naive the plan had been. Reproducing the drug, let alone neutralizing its side effects, would take a company the size of Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson 10 to 20 years of work and tens of billions of dollars. I would be long dead before any of that finished. That left one route. Use NZT to generate income, buy a factory or some equivalent industrial space, and use the building's 380-volt supply to charge the drive properly. From there, everything else became possible. The alternative was to stop taking the pill now, after only one dose, save the money the slow way, and resume only once I had instantiated the permanent immunity shot. It was the safer plan on paper. The problem was that without the drug, I was an ordinary biology student. I could probably make a comfortable living over a career, but not the kind of money that bought factories, and not on any timeline that mattered. There was also the drug itself. I had taken exactly one pill, and the prospect of going back to not having clarity like that, now that I knew what it felt like to keep it, was already pulling at me. The film had framed the addiction as a physical dependency, but the psychological half was just as real. Anyone who had felt complete control once was going to chase it, and I was not going to be the exception. So I was not stopping. Selling pills for cash was also out, and so was tapping into a high-voltage line without paying for it. Either of those ended in attention I could not afford. I had no memory of falling asleep. I had spent the hours after the dormitory went quiet pulling information off the internet on every subject I might eventually need, picking up enough rudimentary hacking along the way to get around the guest restrictions on a few academic forums. The drug made the internet usable in a way it had not been before, since most of what was online was garbage and most people drowned in the volume of it. NZT did the sorting for me. The drug wore off somewhere around 2 in the morning. Exhaustion hit me like a curtain coming down, and I went to bed without closing the laptop. The sleep was not restful. Whatever residual brain activity NZT had left behind kept generating nightmares I could not pull myself out of. Wang Wei woke me up shouting that we were late for Professor Wang Shi's morning class. I sat up and immediately felt like I had been hit by a flu. My head was splitting, the room was spinning, and my stomach turned over hard enough that I got off the bunk and ran for the toilet without saying anything. While I was retching into the bowl, I could hear the others talking about me through the door. Wang Wei was wondering why my reaction was worse than Joe Ji's, who had actually been drinking. Joe Ji speculated that I was heartbroken. Li Bo had a complete theory of the case, that I had spent all my money on a girl, that I was the kind of lapdog who would always lose, and that this explained why I had been eating buns out of a plastic bag the night before. I splashed cold water on my face, came out, and told them I had the flu. Joe Ji immediately asked whether I was on cephalosporins. I did not bother engaging. The four of us got ready in a rush. Wang Wei offered to lend me money for the month on the way over. I told him I still had enough, bought a cup of hot soy milk and 2 more buns at the canteen. And by the time I had finished the soy milk, I felt almost human again. Winter solstice was a few weeks away, and the morning was cold enough to fog my breath. We slipped into the back of the classroom late. Professor Wang Shi was already on the platform pacing and grinning. He liked to open with something well off the textbook, and today's topic was the relationship between theology and science. He asked how many of us had heard the line that science ends in theology, and almost everyone in the room put a hand up. He laid out the standard story first. Newton and Einstein, the two most cited figures in the history of physics, had both spent significant portions of their lives studying theology. The internet, he said, was full of people wondering whether the two of them had found some secret hiding behind their equations. Then he took the story apart. Newton had been born in 1643, in a Europe governed by theocracy, into a society that gave its newborns Catholic baptism by default. He had received a theological education from infancy. Roughly 80% of his lifetime output had been theological writing, over 1,000,000 words of it. And his late-life obsession with proving the existence of God was not a turn away from physics, but a continuation of what he had been doing the entire time. Newton had not been a scientist who eventually drifted into theology. He had always been a theologian first and a physicist second.